Right now, the most important 21 miles of water on the face of this earth are not under American control. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow choke point between Iran and Oman, carries roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas every single day. And as of right now, it is effectively closed, not by an act of God, not by a storm, by miscalculation, the kind of miscalculation that empires make when they believe their own propaganda a little too long. The Trump administration underestimated Iran's willingness to shut down the strait prior to launching the war. Let that sink in. The most powerful military machine in the history of the world walked into a theater it didn't fully understand, and Iran, a country that has been under sanctions, under siege, and under bombardment for decades, did exactly what it said it would do. It closed the door. And now, Washington is scrambling to figure out how to open it back up. Oil tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remains at a near standstill. Brent crude has risen above $100 per barrel again. Lufthansa has cut 20,000 flights through October because jet fuel prices have doubled since the war began. The shockwaves are moving through the global economy in real time, and most Americans are only now beginning to feel them at the pump, at the grocery store, and in their retirement accounts. 13 U.S. service members have been killed. Nearly 3,400 people have died inside Iran since strikes began on February 28th. These are not abstractions. These are human beings caught inside the machinery of a geopolitical gamble that was sold to the public as swift, decisive, and clean. This is what imperial overreach looks like, not in the history books, but in real time. And the question you need to be asking isn't whether America can win a naval battle in the Strait. The question is, what does winning even mean when the waterway is already the graveyard of your strategy? Stay with me, because what comes next in Hormuz will define the next decade of American power. Let me take you back to the beginning of all of this, because context is everything when you're trying to understand a situation of this magnitude. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched surprise airstrikes on Iran, targeting military and government sites, as well as assassinating Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and other Iranian officials. Think about that for a moment. The assassination of a sitting head of state. This wasn't a surgical strike on a missile depot somewhere in the desert. This was the deliberate killing of a nation's leader, an act that, by any historical measure, is an act of war of the highest order, and Washington launched it in the middle of ongoing nuclear negotiations. That detail alone should stop every thinking American in their tracks. Now, you might have seen the press conferences. You might have seen Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth standing at that Pentagon podium talking about major combat operations and the elimination of Iran's missile capability, and on the surface, it sounds like strength. It sounds decisive, but there is a vast difference between what power looks like from a podium in Washington and what it feels like from the deck of a warship in the Persian Gulf. And that gap, that enormous, costly gap between perception and reality, is exactly what the Strait of Hormuz has been exposing day after day since this war began. In the 40 days since the start of Operation Epic Fury, 13 U.S. service members have been killed and 381 have been wounded, according to U.S. Central Command. Now, I want you to sit with those numbers for a second, because they're being presented to the American public as manageable, as acceptable. But let me tell you what those numbers actually represent. Missing from the Pentagon tally is Maj Sorfli Davius, a signals and communication officer with the New York Army National Guard, who reportedly died of sudden illness while on duty in Camp Buehring, Kuwait, on March 6, 2026. He was honored by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He died in theater during this war, and yet his name doesn't make the official count. If they're already playing games with the numbers at this early stage, what does that tell you about the information architecture that's been built around this entire operation? It tells you that the true human cost is being managed, not reported. It's being curated for public consumption, not delivered as the honest reckoning that the American people deserve. The DCAS figures show that at least 63 Navy personnel have been wounded in action. Missing, however, are the more than 200 sailors treated for smoke inhalation or lacerations due to a March 12th fire that raged aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford. Now here's where the story gets truly remarkable. The USS Gerald R. Ford is the crown jewel of the American naval fleet. It's the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built. It cost the American taxpayer approximately $13 billion, and on March 12th, just 2 weeks into this war, it caught fire. The fire originated in a laundry system and spread through ventilation ducts. lasted more than 30 hours, and resulted in over 200 personnel being treated for smoke inhalation and more than 100 sleeping spaces being destroyed. The Navy's most powerful warship, sidelined by a laundry fire, and the Pentagon's official casualty count doesn't include any of those 200-plus sailors who breathed in that smoke and lost their sleeping quarters in the middle of a combat zone. This is the kind of institutional dishonesty that erodes trust, not just in the government, but in the entire strategic narrative being fed to the American public about how this war is going. The Ford had been deployed since June 24, 2025, and had accumulated roughly 9 to 10 months at sea, exceeding the standard 6-month deployment cycle and increasing cumulative strain on onboard systems. This is the part that the talking heads on cable news aren't explaining to you. The American military is not just fighting Iran right now, it is fighting the accumulated exhaustion of a force that has been stretched, extended, and over-deployed for years. When you run the world's most complex warship past its maintenance window, bad things happen. Not because the sailors are incompetent, they are by any measure extraordinary men and women, but because machines have limits. And when you push the most powerful military machine in human history beyond its operational limits because you're trying to project dominance across the entire globe simultaneously, you get fires in laundry rooms on $13 billion aircraft carriers in the middle of active wars. The U.S. Navy replaces the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford with USS George H.W. Bush after a major onboard fire forced the Ford out of operations near Iran, so they sent another carrier, a replacement, because the optics of having only one carrier in the region during a war of this scale were untenable. And this is the kind of reactive, optics-driven decision-making that has characterized American military strategy in the region from the very first day. The Trump administration underestimated Iran's willingness to shut down the strait prior to launching the war, a move that could have likely been prevented if the U.S. had positioned military assets nearby at the outset to deter or respond to Tehran. Read that again. Senior officials familiar with the planning told CNN that the closure of the strait, the single most catastrophic economic consequence of this war, was preventable. It was a foreseeable outcome that was either not anticipated or not taken seriously enough to act on before the first bomb dropped. That's not a tactical error, that's a strategic failure of the first order. Now think about what the closure of the Strait of Hormuz actually means in practical dollars and cents terms for ordinary Americans. The war's economic impact includes the world's biggest oil supply disruption since the 1970s energy crisis, with surges in oil and gas prices, disruptions in aviation and tourism, and volatility in financial markets. The 1970s energy crisis, that's the comparison being made, that's the scale of what's happening right now, and most Americans are experiencing it not through the lens of geopolitics, but through the pump prices at their local gas station and the airline tickets that are suddenly twice the price they were 6 months ago. German airline Lufthansa said that because the price of jet fuel had doubled since the start of the war, it was cutting 20,000 flights through October in an attempt to save fuel. That's just one European airline. United Airlines has been similarly hammered. The ripple effects of this conflict are moving through every sector of the global economy with devastating efficiency, and the end is nowhere in sight. Let me tell you about something that happened on March 10th, which I think crystallizes the entire strategic disaster of this war into a single incident. U.S. military intelligence sources reported that Iran had begun planting naval mines in the Strait of Hormuz, naval mines, in 2026. One of the oldest, most low-tech weapons in the history of naval warfare, and Iran was using them to keep the most powerful navy in the world from controlling a 21-mile stretch of water. And it worked. It worked because asymmetric warfare always works when you understand the terrain better than your adversary. Iran has been thinking about how to fight the United States Navy in the Strait of Hormuz for decades. They've wargamed it, they've drilled it, they've built their entire military doctrine around making that narrow waterway into a trap. Fast attack boats, submarine-launched torpedoes, shore-based anti-ship missiles, drone swarms, and now mines. Iran doesn't need to sink an aircraft carrier to win this confrontation, they just need to make the cost of using the strait too high for anyone to bear. And that is precisely what they've done. On March 9th, Trump said that the war is very complete, pretty much, and claimed that the Iranian military had been destroyed and the Strait of Hormuz had reopened. That statement was made on March 9th. And in the weeks that followed, Iran seized commercial ships, mined the waterway, blockaded the Gulf, charged vessels up to $2 million per transit in tolls, and brought global oil prices back above $100 a barrel. If that's what a destroyed Iranian military looks like, we need to fundamentally reconsider what victory means in the 21st century. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is still boarding and seizing ships. Brent crude has risen above $100 per barrel again as tanker traffic through the strait remains at a near standstill. This is the reality on the ground, and it's a reality that directly contradicts the triumphalist language that's been flowing from the White House since day one of this conflict. Here's the thing that nobody in mainstream media is connecting for you, and it's the connection that matters most. Iran doesn't need to defeat the United States militarily. Iran already achieved its strategic objective the moment it closed the Strait of Hormuz, because by closing that strait, Iran forced the United States into an impossible position. If Washington tries to force the strait open by pushing its warships through, it risks direct naval combat with a force that has been specifically designed and armed for exactly that scenario: fast boats, mines, shore missiles, drones, swarms. If Washington backs down and negotiates, it signals to the entire world that American military dominance has limits, that the mighty U.S. Navy can be checked by a nation that has been under sanctions for 40 years. Both of those outcomes represent a geopolitical defeat for the American empire, regardless of how many Iranian naval vessels are sunk or how many targets are struck from 30,000 feet. And this is the lesson that empires always learn too late, that the map of the world you drew in your mind is not the map of the world that actually exists. A temporary ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran has been in place for about 2 weeks, but the U.S. has continued enforcing a naval blockade on Iranian ports at President Trump's direction, so you have a ceasefire in name. But underneath that ceasefire, you have a dual blockade, with both sides economically strangling each other and the rest of the world paying the price. Iran is reiterating it won't accept a lasting ceasefire as long as the U.S. maintains a naval blockade on Iranian ships trying to enter or exit the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's parliament speaker said plainly that a full ceasefire only makes sense if it is not violated by the blockade. And Trump, for his part, posted on Truth Social that if he opens the strait, there can never be a deal with Iran. These two positions are structurally incompatible. That's not a negotiation, that's two parties using the language of diplomacy while continuing the logic of war. And then there's the deeper question that no one in Washington seems willing to ask out loud. Who actually benefits from this? The oil markets are in turmoil. The U.S. military has now spent an estimated $18 billion in the first 3 weeks of the war alone, with the Pentagon requesting a further $200 billion. By March 31st, the cost to Arab countries was estimated at over $120 billion, and the Iranian government assessed the damage to their own economy as at least $300 billion. These are staggering numbers. But here's what's interesting, and this is where the geopolitics get truly Machiavellian. Iran announced that ships owned by 5 nations, China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, would be allowed to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Everyone else gets blocked, everyone else pays the price. China, which receives a third of its oil through the strait, keeps getting its oil. Russia, which is benefiting from elevated oil prices, keeps prospering. The multipolarity that Washington has been trying to prevent for 30 years is being enacted in real time, right there in a 21-mile-wide choke point in the Persian Gulf. Iran's military unveiled what state media described as a first homegrown long-range naval cruise missile that employs artificial intelligence in the software, with the defense minister claiming it could fire at moving targets at sea from hidden inland positions and completely destroy enemy ships, frigates, and destroyers. Now, whether you take that claim at full face value or apply appropriate skepticism, the underlying message is impossible to ignore. Iran has been preparing for this fight for years. Years of sanctions, years of isolation, years of being told that American power would one day come for them, and they used every one of those years to build asymmetric capabilities specifically designed to bloody the most advanced military on Earth without ever having to meet it on even terms. That is strategic patience at a level that Washington, with its 4-year political cycles and its quarterly earnings mindset, simply cannot replicate. Military planners from more than 30 countries are meeting at a Royal Air Force base north of London to put together a multinational mission to safeguard the Strait of Hormuz. 30 nations gathering to figure out how to reopen a waterway that the most powerful military in human history cannot reopen by itself. Let that image sit in your mind. And understand that what you are witnessing right now, in real time, is not just a war between the United States and Iran. What you are witnessing is the stress test of American primacy. The moment where decades of assumptions about unipolar dominance are being run against the hard wall of physical reality. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a geographic bottleneck, it is a mirror. And what it's reflecting back at Washington right now is an image that the architects of American foreign policy are not prepared to accept. The ceasefire is fragile. Iran renewed its attacks on commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz while calling the U.S. military's blockade of Iranian ports a breach of the ongoing ceasefire. The mines are still in the water, the warships are still positioned, the negotiations are stalled. Pakistan, acting as intermediary, is urging both sides back to the table. The EU is widening sanctions on Tehran. U.S. military planners are developing options with a particular focus on dynamic targeting of Iran's capabilities around the strait, potential attacks against small fast attack boats, mine-laying vessels, and other asymmetric assets. In other words, the military is preparing for round two. The pause is not a peace, it's a breath between rounds. And here is the final truth that I think you need to sit with, regardless of where you stand politically on any of this. 13 American service members are dead, nearly 400 have been wounded, and that's using the Pentagon's own carefully curated numbers, not the full picture. Sailors breathed smoke on the ford. Soldiers died in Kuwait when a missile slipped through the air defenses. More than 3,600 documented deaths inside Iran include over 1,100 civilians. There are children in that count. And the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow ribbon of water, remains, right now, as this video plays, a contested graveyard of strategy, ambition, and lives. The question America has to ask itself is not whether we have the firepower to win this. We clearly do. The question is whether we have the wisdom to define what winning actually means before the next round begins. Because right now, no one in Washington seems to have a credible answer to that question. And the rest of the world is watching very closely.